So this here is a quick little tip with relation to the placement of your action camera, whether it is a Insta360 or a GoPro or DJI Action 2 or something like that, for the purposes of a gyro data stabilization using Gyroflow. And so in this case, one of the things that you have to pay attention to is, because one of the challenges, in my case actually, I like to not just stabilize the footage on my Canon from the gyro data, but I also like to use the footage together, right? So this is going to be my wide angle capture, and this becomes my medium or standard angle capture. I'm at a 30 millimeter with the focal reducer and the 1.6x crop. I'm literally getting about 35 millimeters, close to 35 millimeter field of view. And then with this, although it's a 14 millimeter lens, the Insta360 Leica 1-inch edition, with whatever cropping that I do, because it's capturing 5K, I end up getting something close to a 17 millimeter field of view. So 17 paired with 35, I think, is a great combination. Now, the thing is, with the placement, one of the things that you'll notice that they're very close together. So if any subject is actually close to the camera, whether it's really close or far away, they're going to be both in shot, and they'll be framed relatively close to each other. I will frame it primarily on my Canon, and then I might adjust the framing a little bit on the Insta360. Now, one of the challenges with this kind of setup also is when I have a shotgun mic like this, part of the shotgun mic ends up showing into the shot of the wide angle, but that's easily addressed by simply sliding this back as such. Now, the challenge with this kind of setup, though, is if I'm using a lens that's slightly larger than this. One of my other go-to lenses is a 28 to 105 millimeter from Tamron. When fully extended, it comes out to something like this. Now, that lens ends up being in the shot of the camera. So what I end up doing is I end up taking this off and I mount it right on top of the top handle over here.
Let me look at that camera there. Look at that nice lens there. You take a picture of me too.
I've been getting you the whole time.
He's been recording this whole thing.
The key thing to stay cognizant of is that when you move the action camera into a different position in relation to the sensor plane, the further out you are, this movement here is going to be magnified all the way up here because just physics of it. Also, this movement here, which is the tilt, that will also be magnified just simply due to where the thing is placed. So sometimes what will happen is the readings on the gyro data for the action cam might be a little bit more spiky, if that's the appropriate term, will be a little bit more spiky with relation to what gyro data, or rather what the readings are coming off from the camera itself. But the one reading that will always stay consistent is the roll. And the roll is essentially this movement right here when you are turning. And so regardless of whether the camera is, or the action camera is mounted on top, or if it's mounted at the side, or if the orientation, meaning if it's this way versus like, because if you were to turn it upside down, doesn't matter what the orientation is, this movement will always stay consistent. And so the thing that you want to match to, that's the thing that you always want to pay attention to. So in terms of the setup, that's one of the first things that you want to be cognizant of, that you are getting that setting right, is like knowing where you are. That's item number one. Number two is also the relative time difference between when you press record on the action camera versus when you press record on the camera that you're going to be stabilizing after the fact. So in my case, I'll always press record first on the action camera, so I have more gyro data than I have footage. But the thing is, I'll press and then I'll press, right? There's not going to be much of a delay, maybe a second. Sometimes I'll do it together, but the recording, this will record after. If I press it together, this starts recording after this does. So that's why I press record here, I press record here. And then when I cut recording, I'll cut record here, and then I'll cut record here. So this way I'll always have as much, if not more, gyro data than I will have the footage itself, and it allows for pairing a little bit faster. So now let's take a look within the edit in terms of what that would look like. And especially in the context of the Insta360 that I have here. The orientation, this is not the standard orientation. In fact, because this is the brain right here, so this is a modular system, you've got the lens, you've got the brain, and then you've got the battery. And so normally the brain would be facing this way, right? The screen is on the outside. It would be on this side for easier viewing. But because I want the lens to be placed closer to the camera body for a more similar framing, the orientation of this is essentially, according to the data, this is actually upside down. And so I'll have to take note of that within Gyroflow, and I'll walk you through what I mean with relation to how to make sure that your footage is synced up and it is all within the appropriate orientation.
So this next part of this video is going to go into showcasing some of the challenges that comes to with relation to Gyroflow. The things, not necessarily challenges, but you got to be cognizant of. I shot a video using the same exact setup that you saw earlier, the 30 millimeter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select 35 because I'm looking at a 30 millimeter lens, which is this guy right here. So this 30 millimeter lens attached with a focal reducer, you multiply that by 0.71, right? And then you multiply that by the camera's crop factor. In my case, the crop factor is 1.6. So 30 times 0.71 times 1.6 ends up being close to like 34 point something millimeters. So I'll just round that up to 35 millimeters. And so 35 millimeter full frame field of view. So what I'll do is I'll do 35 millimeter, and then I will do 3840 for resolution match, and then I'll do 23.9 since that was the frame rate. And from here, I might select something like, here we go, Sigma 35 millimeter 1.4, just to get the lens profile. Now this is unofficial, but I'm looking at the field of view and the resolution to kind of match as best as possible. Here's the frame rate over here on the original footage and the resolution that it was captured at. So that stuff kind of matches up more or less. And then from here, what I'm going to do is, now this next part I feel like is important, especially because assuming you've captured your shutter speed to be high enough so that there's motion blur that's minimized. One of the things that I like to do is reduce the rolling shutter or correct for it. Now this requires that you know the sensor readout speed. So on my camera, which is the Canon EOS M6 Mark II, it's about 17 milliseconds. And so I'll go ahead and correct that. Now the next thing has to do with, now I know this particular footage, which is, this is the Canon footage right here. I've already loaded up the Insta360 file that corresponds with and was recorded alongside the Canon footage. And so the thing is, this footage, I know that I ended up recording the Canon footage almost 5 seconds prior to whenever I started recording. So one of the things I like to do is I make those synchronization, like the gyro offset, I'll do like 7 seconds. Synchronize the data search, the search size, I'll make that 7 seconds. The time to analyze, I'll also make that 7 seconds, just above the lag. And then this right here is the IMU orientation. One thing to pay attention to is, so here's what I'm going to do. I want to zoom in right here into the readings. Let's look at Y, right? Y is the yaw. And the yaw, I believe, has to do, if I'm not mistaken, has to do with the same movement as like if it's panning. So if your camera is facing like this, you know, if you pan left or right, that's similar to the yaw, if I'm not mistaken. And so here's one of the things about the Y axis. When you do Y lowercase, that's right side up, and then Y uppercase is upside down. And so you'll notice that the lines are going to change. The other thing has to do with pitch, right? Pitch has to do with, so if this is an airplane, this is yaw, and this is pitch. And so in this case, what I'm looking at is, because it's upside down, the yaw and the pitch, the X and Y axes are flipped. So if I change from that capital to the lowercase, then it'll also flip the readings. Now, one thing that you'll notice is the roll axis, right? So the roll axis being like this, right? AKA Inception, or that scene in Inception. It doesn't matter if I do. Now this will flip. This only flips if, let's assume you have your cell phone that's recording the data, right? It doesn't matter if your phone is like this or if it's like this. This movement is still the same. The only instance in which this movement is going to be flipped is if it's facing a different direction. So instead of it facing this way, it's now facing this way. So this rotation is suddenly the opposite of this rotation, if you're following. So that's why if I change this to lowercase z, it'll flip it. But because the camera, it was not facing the opposite direction, I don't need to switch it. Now that we're understanding of all of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn on all of the visual facets. Now you don't have to, but I want to showcase an example here. And I want to right click and I'll do auto sync, right? I've already told it to seek about 7 seconds worth of time. So that way it's able to find the appropriate information. You'll notice there's a bunch of peaks in the red, which is essentially left and right. And there's a bunch of peaks in the green, which has to do with up and down. And one thing you'll notice is all of the footage is suddenly, it's lined up. But the more important thing is I'm looking at the roll axis to be lined up. And one of the things that you can do is you can press and hold the Alt key. I'm using PC, so I'm pressing Alt key and I scroll up on the mouse wheel just to further exaggerate the frequency up and down on the line. I'll see that it's completely matched up. If you set the gyro offset and the sync search size to the appropriate time to which the footage was that you needed to be matched up, then everything is going to line up appropriately. And that's why I look at this in terms of the roll size, because sometimes you might forget to do the X and Y, and it might sync up here, but then you'll notice that Y and P, yaw and pitch, aka XY axes, why don't they line up? Right now they line up, but if I switched it back to its original, so lowercase y, capital X, right, you'll be like, why doesn't it line up? And the reason it's not lining up is because I've told the data the wrong information, in the sense that the orientation of the camera is not what I'm setting it to be. So I got to set the orientation appropriately, which is capital Y and X. Now, this is specifically for the Insta360 because of its modular design. I don't believe, if I'm not mistaken, I don't believe this is an issue with the GoPro, but it's worth looking into if you're having any kind of sync issues. I haven't used the GoPro in a little while, and I haven't had the need to, since I've got the Insta360 and it works just fine. And I use the Insta360 for footage as well. That's why I like the footage that comes out of Insta360 with this larger sensor over the image of the GoPro. And so applying a little bit of noise reduction for the Insta360 just, I feel like, makes it look really good. And so once everything lines up, that's when you can kind of play this back, and you'll notice everything is more or less smooth. And one thing I like to do, just as in terms of zooming and whatnot, I like to set this to dynamic zooming. I set the zoom speed to maybe 5 seconds or more. And if I wanted it to be a little bit smoother, I could even increase that to say maybe 10 seconds. That way there's a gradual in and out with relation to how the camera is cropping in to adjust for the movement. Now, I don't like to go crazy on the adjustments here. This just has to do with the smoothness. I keep this at this is after stabilizing hours and hours of footage, shooting, I don't know, God knows how many videos over these last few months. But thing is, the max smoothness at high velocity, I am just literally trying to get rid of the micro jitters, nothing more. I'm not necessarily trying to make it look like a gimbal. I like some of that handheld, just above handheld smoothness, but not as smooth as a gimbal, because there's a little bit of that kinetic energy that still comes with the movement of the camera. And so for that reason, I like to put the max smoothness at high velocity at 0.05 seconds and the max smoothness at 0.5 seconds. And then when it comes to the pitch, yaw, and roll smoothness, I'll keep that below the 0.1. So even 0.72, 0.78, 0.72, just about this much. And in my opinion, I feel like this is the appropriate amount of smoothness that I would desire from what I'm trying to capture. This is the before, this is the after. Even the before, like with the rig that you saw, it's pretty smooth in my hands because it's got a little bit of weight to it and I can rest it against my body. But when I move with it, obviously there's going to be a little bit of that jerkiness. But the moment I add a little bit of that smoothness, everything looks pretty good. And in these moments where it's zoom cropped in a little bit tight, I can always cut to the Insta360 angle to give myself a little bit of a wider shot. And so so this is, again, the original footage right here. It's a little bit shaky and then cropped in a little bit, and you can kind of see what's that looking like. And we're getting the tour of the dojo. But anyway, coming back to the intent of this video, which has to do with the lineup, just make sure you know the sync difference. Now, one of the ways that you can do this is the brute force. So this is the original footage here. And you'll notice how I just go ahead and touch the camera to press record, or just to kind of adjust the camera. Like this is what it looks like originally. And then like this is the Insta360 footage, and that's the proxy file that it creates, the Pro LRV, FYI. I think it's a default thing, or maybe you have to enable it. But then you also have the high resolution 5K file. And then obviously I'm a little bit overexposed, so I'll have to fix that in the edit. I'm shooting in log for the Insta360. But then if I go back to the this footage right here, you'll notice there's significantly more time. And then when I cut to this part, boom, right when I touch the camera, I'm already like just about 7 seconds in. And so I know just by looking at that, all right, you know what? I pressed record on the Insta360 about 5 to 7 seconds after I had pressed record, which is literally the opposite of what I recommend, right? I recommend press record on the Insta360 first and then press record on the camera. So this way you have more gyro data. So all of that, like those first 7 seconds, is not going to be stabilized. But in the case and the purpose of this video, I don't start actually gathering meaningful content for the purpose of the video until after I press record for the second, which is the Insta360. So just a heads up, make sure you know how much of a time difference there is. That is the offset with relation to milliseconds. So every 7 seconds is equal to 7,000 milliseconds. In reality, this is the actual offset. 5.208.99, well, 5,208.99 milliseconds, which is 5.20899 seconds. That's how much the offset actually was. But because I set the gyro offset to 7 seconds, the search size, all that within the actual offset size, it was able to find it, and it was able to synchronize it accordingly across all three of these axes, which is, most importantly, I'm looking at the roll, right? I want to stabilize the roll of the camera. I want to stabilize the tilt or the pitch of the camera, and I want to stabilize the pan or the yaw of the camera. So the fact that I was able to do all of that just automatically works out great. Sometimes it's like, hey, you know what? I don't know. Like it might be, there's been a couple of times a situation where I started recording like 5 minutes after. So like 5 minutes of footage that's not going to be stabilized. Okay, that's fine, right? I might have a wide angle on a tripod, which I can cut to, or a couple of tripods I can cut to. And then when I want to get to the floating footage, aka handheld, then I'll start the synchronization at that offset. But you got to know what that offset is. And sometimes if I don't have this, let's say I delete all the sync points, but I know I'm like 15 milliseconds off, I can right click, add manual sync point, hit that icon, or not the icon, but the marker. And then from here, you can adjust the actual time manually. So if I was 15 seconds or 5 minutes off, right? then if I were to do the numbers, right, if 5 times 5 times 60, right? So 5 times 60, that's how many seconds? 300 seconds times 1,000, right? That's 300,000 milliseconds, right? So then you would put that number into the offset if you were off by that ridiculous amount. But normally it's like in my case, if I press one right after the other, it's anywhere between 2 to 5 seconds. But if I forgot, and then I remembered momentarily after that, it's typically 5 to 7 seconds. So long as you get your, so in this case, if I knew it was 5 seconds, I want to manually sync this. 5 milliseconds being 5,000, 5 seconds being 5,000 milliseconds. And I go ahead and then I zoom into that. I'm like, oh, I'm already almost there. From there, I can just go ahead and grab that manually and I can drag that over until I am in alignment. And that's really it. So, but the easier thing to do is set your appropriate offset. And then you can say delete all the sync points and then tell it to synchronize auto sync here. And it'll just go ahead, it'll analyze the timeline with relation to the amount of the setting, and it should be able to find everything you're looking for. Boom, everything's in sync and everything's looking nice and smooth. And so that's it. I hope this was helpful to you. So long as you know your focal length, you know how much the offset was in terms of time-wise, you know your rolling shutter, i.e. sensor readout speed, put all that data into the software and you should be good to go. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. I'll see you soon.